Good morning, everyone. Oh, I love brown people. Thank you. First of all, thank you all for coming. I saw some of you at Fuel last night, so I want to thank you for making it from the bar downstairs up to here this morning. Very impressive. But yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for taking the time to come in this morning. Have a wonderful set of colleagues. I will not talk too much because I want these amazing folks to have a lot of the floor. But one of the things I will say, the conversation that we've been having and the conversations that are happening around the country, there's this really important conversation around how do we engage in the concept of systemic change. And what does that look like in organizations, particularly organizations that are trying to amplify voices of folks from disinvested communities, folks from communities of color, individuals of color, and women of color. And so the conversation that we started this morning with my colleagues here, and I'll give you all a moment to introduce yourselves, was very much in that vein. And we will not only have a conversation today about ceding power, which is what we're centering on today, but we'll also have a conversation about what it looks like to share power. And those things, I think, are very important companions to each other as we're navigating this idea and concept around systemic change. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Please just introduce yourselves. Give maybe a 1 minute on your thoughts on the subject, but also about yourself, so folks can get a chance to know you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So I'm Marcia Sells. I'm, oh gosh, okay. Nice to meet you all. I also use she, her pronouns. I am the Chief Diversity Officer and Assistant General Manager at the Met. I'm the first Chief Diversity Officer at the Met. February 20th, I will have been there 3 years. And I have to say, honestly, it has gone by quickly. And I'll say honestly, there were moments I wasn't sure I was going to last 2 months. And that's also because when I started this work, we were all still living in the pandemic, and so much was virtual, and that was also the question of, whether or not we were going to even be able to be in performance. So I do think that even my role, my title, my job, I report directly to Peter Gelb, who's the general manager. I'm one of 7 assistant general managers. We now have 2 deputy general managers. But the creation of this role is not so much in terms of ceding power, but recognizing that power needs to be dispersed in some new places and making sure that somebody is looking out and reviewing and focusing intentionally on how do we bring in new audience, how do we bring in new stories, how do we engage staff and make all staff working at the institution feel connected to the work. So that's me.
Thank you. My name is Shea Scruggs. I'm the Chief Enrollment Officer and Director of Institutional Research and Musician Experience at Curtis Institute of Music, which basically is probably the longest title in the history of organizations. It means that I do admissions, alumni relations, and institutional research. My background is as an oboe player. I played in the San Francisco Opera, the Baltimore Symphony, and several other orchestras. And I'm also a founding member of the Black Orchestral Network, and I came into EDI work after I got my MBA, and there was this guy named Donald Trump doing all kinds of things and saying all kinds of things, and I saw an area where I felt a lot of purpose and found myself on a lot of consulting groups and working groups. And today we're hoping to talk about, one of the things we want to talk about is how power is not finite. It can be multiplied and amplified if you invest in it in the right way in your organization.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexa Smith. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Director for Anti-Racism, Equity, and Belonging at the Public Theater in New York City. And that is also a new role. Just a little bit on the public, since I'm in music land. The Public Theater is a nonprofit theater. It is the largest one in the U.S. We are a nonprofit, but we also have a producing arm that is commercial, where we transfer things to Broadway. So we created a small show you may have heard of called Hamilton. that went to Broadway, thankfully successful. So I say my entire job is funded by white guilt and Hamilton money. No lies. But I love my job. Excited to share more of the practices from the American theater that I think that we can really use in the classical world. I was a soprano. I went to Manhattan School of Music. I later worked there in the president's office, and I still keep one foot in classical. I work at the Met Radio, and I'm one of the new hosts for WQXR's Young Artist Showcase, so I'm still in your world firmly, I assure you. But yeah, we have a lot to talk about, and I'm excited to get into it with these lovely people. So.
Thank you, everyone. I didn't introduce myself. Hi, Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston. I use the He series. My first question for us to just have a little bit of a conversation about is, oftentimes a lot of organizations, they will move into tactics too early, and they have no sense of what their ideal is, what their vision is. So you'll see these organizations, they'll be like, oh, we did this, and we have this program, we have this program, we have this program, and you look at them and they have no actual vision. They're just going programmatically and tactically thing to thing, and it looks like what a Southerner would call a hot mess. So my question for you all, I was thinking about this idea of the ideal situation, the ideal disbursement, the ideal sharing of power, the ideal ceding of power, and maybe using some of your own institutions, either the ones you're currently with or ones you've been part of. I'd love to hear just your thoughts on what would the ideal look like. And don't worry, we don't have to go down the line. And please feel free to jump in with each other. This is more of a conversation rather than you feel like you have to give your sense of the ideal.
Well, I will say, I don't know if this is the ideal, but I do know one of the things that the Met did, and in some ways it's also the challenge for the person, and I say that as the person who wound up being the first person to take the role as Chief Diversity Officer. I mean, the Met on its website, like a lot of arts organizations, I also worked in higher ed before this. After the murder of George Floyd, lots of statements. The Met put on its website that it would do 4 things. 1, hire a chief diversity officer. 2, that they were going to start a paid internship program, that they were going to have conversations with the staff to gather information or what they called a listening tour, and then also to create systems to assess information, where the organization was on a number of things in terms of both audience, staff, singers, performers. What did those numbers look like? So those were those 4 things, which I think was probably wise to limit it to something very finite. At least hire somebody who then that's their job to figure out and to begin shaping what the structure or the strategy looks like. But also say we are invested in this idea of creating the next generation, starting that right away, so having a paid internship program, and acknowledging that we probably don't know some of the answers. And I will say, I am not sure, since how they thought about this. I can only frame it from my imagination and hope that when they were thinking, we probably need to speak to the people who work here to find out information about what things are working or not working. So that's the listening tour. And every organization that's doing work around DEI, or even any organization, every organization looks at ticket sales, or they look at numbers in terms of outreach. So having a commitment that you're actually going to do some work to create that. So I think that's, because I've seen organizations that put out those statements and they had 14 things down and already set even before anybody could take a job. I mean, at least in this, I walked into a space where I could use my knowledge and skill to help frame what was going to be the next step and invite people in to have those kinds of conversations. So I'm not saying that has to be the ideal, but I do think at least acknowledging you need somebody who's going to be in charge and you can say and point to is going to be responsible and engaging the institution, and then also acknowledging that for this, particularly for our art form, for classical, so I didn't mention I started off life as a ballerina. from Cincinnati, Ohio, so I know the classical art field. I was a ballerina in the 60s, and before Missy Copeland.
Let's go.
Just saying. I started out at CCM. That was my the preparatory program. So I've lived in the world where there has only been one of me in that space, but now. So it's important that you have somebody who's then going to be responsible for that work.
Before we go on to the next person, I think a lot about this idea of these different roles that we put in place, these organizations that we coined a term this morning. Because I ain't scared.
You
we
did.
talked about predominantly white institutions, which is this what we call a lot of the institutions we work within and work for, and then there's also WAC white organizations. And those
The
are not the same.
WWOs.
WWOs, that's right. WAC, predominantly white organizations, and those are different. There are some predominantly white institutions that are really thinking about this work in a very thoughtful way, even if from a metrics perspective, they're still a white organization. They're on the journey towards the ideal, and then you have these other organizations that are just whack. Like the things that they're doing are whack. The things that they're thinking, the programs they're creating are whack. Black Lives Matter. We don't like black people, actually. Let's put the rainbows up and make sure that we are completely oppressive. And so, those are your WWOs. And so, again, just thinking about this from the perspective of the predominantly white institutions that may be doing solid work, and those that are WWOs as well. I would love to just continue this conversation. What are, as we're thinking about this ideal, what are some of the barriers to our ideal that you have seen? Whether it's, again, within your own organizations or others that you have seen, because I think it's important for people to be able to see the bookends. There are these beautiful things that are happening, but also what are some of the barriers to that? Shea, did you want to?
Yeah. Well, in terms of thinking about some of the ideals, I think you definitely want to see representation in senior leadership and above in the organization. I think that's critically important. I think it's hard to really do good work without that. Another one is strong alignment between the work that is seen as critically important under EDI and then what oftentimes is seen as separate, quote unquote, real work. I think that's one of the barriers, to your point, is oftentimes you'll have organizations where there's not a lot of alignment between the work that may take place under a so-called diversity committee that is supposedly of critical importance, but then it happens sort of in parallel or under or to the side of what everybody understands but doesn't necessarily say is the real work that maybe is led by the senior staff or by another working group. And so I think that can be one of the barriers. And I think in an ideal scenario, you would see very strong alignment between those workflows.
I want to. Oh, please.
Oh, well, I totally agree, and I think a lot of that bubbles up to the values, as we were all talking about earlier. My one observation in this time I've spent in the American theater is that we say the American theater, and we know what those values are. I know if I go to the Guthrie in Minnesota, they're an American theater, and their values align with what we think of in the industry around EDI work, about what the expectations are of what is on stage, whether it's a classic piece or a new piece, the way we value American playwrights. And I think in sort of connecting the dots backwards from the time I spent in the classical world, I'm not sure we actually all agree on what American values are.
Amen.
I like go to the Met, which I love. It's my home opera house, and it's very international. And a lot of times you won't see an American lead artist, and I'm not saying that that's a problem. I'm saying that like the environment that they're going into in a rehearsal setting with conductors that are not American, directors who are sometimes not American, and then lots of different nationalities on stage mean that they may not be all singing from the same hymnal when in terms of culturally how we move through a space. And I think the alignment that you're talking about is it can be sort of segmented because, yes, there's things that happen in boards, there's things that happen in senior leadership, but if the art that we're talking about isn't aligned under values, then I think we're never really gonna see aggressive change. You know, the core work that we do at the Public started with Shakespeare, which is not American. And and it is like the thing that we lean on most. It is like the foundation of what we do is Shakespeare in the Park, which is 2,000 people every single night of the summer can see a Shakespeare play for free. There's no transaction to being able to have access to culture, and we believe that. Every ticket in that space is free, and that is our values as New Yorkers, as Americans, that we believe the culture belongs to everyone. And I never really can say, like, when we talk about the American orchestra, I don't know what that means, actually. What does it mean to be an American orchestra, right? You know?
You know, and in that vein, you know, this idea of recognizing values and aligning oneself with values. One of the things that I did not create this title, and shout out to Kay.
We hope you're feeling better, Kay.
We love you. We hope you're feeling better. I was not the original moderator. There was another person who was meant to moderate. I want to make sure that she is recognized. Thank you for this amazing topic. One of the things that I think a lot about is this idea of power. And you cannot disconnect power from privilege. And I think about my own role as a CEO and executive director, and as a black man, I have multiple marginalizations and privileges in that. There are things that I can do as a black male leader that a black woman leader would not be able to do in the same way. And so this idea of the way that power exists and manifests itself inside institutions is extremely important. And so as we're thinking about this idea of ceding power and how does one do that, or sharing power within an organization, first of all, I'd love to hear how power shows up sometimes in your institutions and in the ones you're working with, because, you know, Shea, I know you're doing a lot of work with Black Orchestral Network, and so there's a lot of thinking around how power manifests itself there, and so please feel free to speak from any of those perspectives. But this idea of power, how do you create ways to cede power? So those of us who have power, how do we develop a skill set in ceding power? And how do those who maybe aren't in certain types of positions have certain types of privileges attached to them? What are the ways in which they can request power and also demand power? Which I think all of your various paths have navigated that particular concept. Shea, please.
I do think, as I said, in that the four first things that the Met said it was going to do, in that having the listening tour is a form of, for many, I mean, corporate organizations have done some of this for a while, but arts organizations, I mean, I come from a generation in a ballet company, you know, Arthur Mitchell used to say, this is not a democracy. Ballet companies aren't, and I think sometimes even with orchestras and opera houses, you know, you have directors who create the space, they create the work, they make those decisions. But when you say you're going to have a listening tour, it's also opening up the opportunity for people within your organization to say the things that sometimes they might have kept to themselves. And you also have to keep doing that work. You have to keep reaching out. That's sometimes why you also have working groups, or also going out in terms of focus groups. I think that's one way, at least, to gather the information. The key part is not just gathering information, but how do you turn what people say into action, into work. And that is, I think, for organizations that begin, for many of our organizations that begin with a top-down model leadership. You either have a general manager, you either have a conductor, you either have an executive director or CEO who then defines what the rules are, or defines what the values are. But if you're opening it up to say, we want to hear from both our performers, our administrative staff, what are their ideas about what we're going to do, and then you actually move that into action, that's, I think, the beginning of if not seeding, but sharing, amplifying, recognizing that you leadership don't have all the answers. And before it was also about boards too, because they're driving the fundraising, they're bringing in the money, but also for all of our art form right now, those who had traditionally been in leadership roles, those who had traditionally been the audience, the demographic numbers, it's just factual. It's aging. So another response, another way, if we want our art form to go forward, had to be in place.
Yeah, and I think that you're bringing up some really important points there. In some consulting work that I've done, one of the most striking moments for me was I was in a focus group, and I'll ask you all to speak to this conceptually as well, where it was an all-white group of individuals, and they all had various power within this organization. And there was one person who it was a man, a white man, and he said, he's like, to be honest, the thing that has me terrified is the idea of potentially being labeled as a bad white person. And it wasn't just that he said that, it was also the reaction of the other people in the room, because they all were like, yeah, that's the terror. You don't want to be labeled as one of the bad ones. That's the thing. And so I think about that often, because there are these individuals who actually, that one I think is being labeled is not as great as saying I actually want to be a good person overall, but that's neither here nor there. But I think that there are these folks, and I think that what we tend to do as people of color and as folks inside in hierarchy, we tend to not actually tell the truth. So we kind of gloss over what the thing is that we really want to say, and what we really want to say is, hey, our institution is a racist institution. That is what our institution is. It's like a 12-step program. You have to say, I am a first, before you go to step 2, right? And so the institutions have to learn how to acknowledge what they are. So if your institution can't say that it is a racist institution that is in process to becoming an anti-racist institution, if your institution can't say that, then it's not going to be able to solve the challenges within itself. Because again, it hasn't first named what it is. What is it that we're solving for? And so no, thank you. Nobody else thought that was a good comment, but me and you, I owe you a coffee, thanks. And so as we're thinking about this idea of being able to name what is the thing, because we're talking about ceding power, basically what we're saying is the power structure has a problem in it. There's a problem in the power, and so we need to rethink what the power structures are. So I'd love to get some thoughts on this idea of what is the problem that we're solving for. I know for me, I believe that there are a lot of racist institutions that have not named themselves as being such. And so to me, that the first thing is some naming, and they may want to name themselves as something else. They may be sexist organizations or whatever. And so my question for you is, when you're thinking about organizations, what are some ways in which these organizations can not only tactically solve some things, but also name what it is they're solving for?
Well, I think one way that organizations can cede power and get a really good sense of what the actual problem that they're trying to solve is basically co-creation. Inviting we'll call it end user into the process to help define the problem and then build the solution. And I think that can be a very powerful tool. Oftentimes in organizations that are, top down for good reasons, leadership can be top down, but oftentimes ideation becomes top down as well. And I think that can lead to programs that don't really align with the needs of the constituent or the end user. One example of that at Curtis is a Purdue program called the Young Alumni Fund. We started it 3 years ago. It started with $20,000 that was basically left over from a different program, and they turned the alumni office loose and said, do something with this. And so what we did was we invited our alumni community in. People volunteered to come in, and it started out with a session on design thinking, and then the second part was looking at different personas of alums, and we designed a program together. And the program was really successful. It had a lot of buy-in, it had a lot of participation, and it worked so well that just one of Curtis's existing donors saw it and asked us to put forward a proposal, and gave Curtis $2 million. So starting next year, we'll be able to distribute $100,000 to alums in grants ranging from $1,000 to $10,000 in perpetuity. And I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't said, look, let's come in and help us decide what this looks like. So I think that's one way.
Any thoughts, Alexa?
I'm like, that's amazing.
I know.
I'm
Can I
still stuck
can I-
on that? You
I
didn't
was about to
share
say,
that
Can I
before.
borrow $5 for gas money? I don't know. Can I?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm trying to think. Like money, right? I think that's really important in terms of power. It kind of is the thing, even in nonprofit. And I have to say that I also went to business school, got my MBA, and my whole time I was like, wow, all these people I have to do my homework with, like, don't understand how wonderful it is to work in a nonprofit environment where, like, you feel like your soul is, like, contributing to something great, because, like, half of the work you do in business school is just about how to make more money. But then I actually felt like, especially being in the role I am now, like kind of reframing that for myself and not thinking of money as being bad in that way, or like getting a bunch of money as being, you know, harmful in some way. It's been really helpful. This is the only place I've worked where I have actually felt like they gave me too much money to work with. And it was a weird feeling. The CFO loves me because I was like, I can give some of this back to this or whatever. He was like, all right. But, you know, I don't have staff. I was telling them earlier, I don't have staff, which is kind of typical for a lot of EDI folks. So I've used money to create other scaffoldings for myself. Lots of subcommittees, which increase buy-in from a lot of people and let them work on very specific processes like living land acknowledgements and things like that. But then I'll say, like, in working commercial theater and Broadway, I'm working on Alicia Keys' musical Hell's Kitchen, which is incredible because our budget's $22 million for Broadway, and hopefully it will also make money. But one thing that was important to Alicia was saying, okay, but what else can we do? We have this moment, we have all these eyes on us. And so we really wanted to do a fellowship program where we could really pay people like a good amount of money to come and just be on our team for 9 weeks in various capacities, director, choreographer, or whatever. And, you know, she was like, all right, what's it cost? And I was like, wait, what? You know? So, you know, we put together a budget. We're going to have 9 fellows. They get $1,200 a week. And she was like, yeah, cool, try it. And I was just like, okay, you know, like, we just had money to just try something. And I'm not used to that feeling of not having to, like, beg and scrap for, like, an idea that I can't even prove yet. So we get to try something with a good amount of budget, and, you know, we already got like 1,500 applicants for it. And I think it's going to be a game-changing thing that we get to do to, like, have more BIPOC folks not on stage but off stage, because we don't have it on Broadway, I'll tell you that. But it took money. Like, really, it took, like, someone to just throw cash at us to say, yeah, try it. And, you know, we just don't get that privilege, like, ever.
And that, I think, is when we're talking about the money, that is also key. There's sometimes that roles like chief diversity officers are started, and you may have just enough money to pay the salary of that one person, and the scope of the work is also going to be so much larger. You do have to have a plan in place that there are going to be other people, because sometimes relying on committee. So I do think the idea of money within not-for-profits, and, you know, we know it in terms of funders. We've always known it also in terms of tickets and sales. It's important for us to think about that, and not to set it up where somebody is in one person in a role trying to do the job or do 14 different jobs. That's not healthy. And when I came in, they said, oh, yes, we're going to have the chief diversity officer role, and we're going to do the paid internships. And I said, well, there's no way that I can do all of those things. And then if I had 1,500 applications, I'd, you know, for the first time around for our internship program, how would I do that review? I'd be doing that all day, so we had to hire. And thankfully, also when we first started, Bank of America was funding us for the paid internship program. We also have a paid fellowship program for finding a director and a stage manager, so stage director, stage manager fellowship, intended to increase the number of people of color and women who are in those roles. So recognizing that this is an opportunity to see the next generation in this work. But we have to acknowledge, it does take money, and you have to have a budget that says, this is important, we value this, so that we can make sure that it happens, and happens in a very, smart way, not, we're just sort of throwing something up in a few programs, and that it's going to continue. So we're in our third year for our stage manager, stage fellow role, so go to the Met Opera website, and also we're in our third season for our paid internship role. Please go to our website, the February 19th for the internship, it closes, so.
Yeah, and I think we were thinking about these large organizations, and I imagine a lot of folks here are from much smaller organizations. Many of us are not getting $2 million for a project. Although I'm gonna ask you for, hook a brother up.
How much did that building you guys just got cost?
I did just buy a building. He's not wrong. But a lot of folks are at smaller organizations, and so when you're someone at a smaller organization, the way that power moves within your organization is actually very, very different. When you're in a smaller organization that's got maybe an executive director and then maybe one other staff person, that's very different than the powers and the way it manifests itself in a multi-level organization that has a president and CEO who has 8 or 9 VPs and so on and so forth. And so there are some differences in the way that those things move. And I guess in every one of y'all, I know y'all and all start at Curtis and the Met, and so everyone was in one of those organizations, has been connected to one of them, either on a board or as. And so when you think about the way that power moves, when the power structure is condensed quite a bit, what would you say to someone who, if I'm on the side that has power, I have one perspective. If I'm on the side that has less power, what would you say to someone who is on this side where I have a little bit less power inside this very small institution, which means the power is concentrated in one individual? What would you say to someone who had to navigate a situation like that?
I mean, I will say I'm very lucky to also have a small organization, because I very gratefully was a recipient of a Sphinx Venture grant a couple years ago. So I actually have a small org that is 2 people most of the time. The Duncan Williams Voice Programs, it started as a voice competition for Black and Brown singers, and we're developing it into something else. And I don't know if Shira is here. Shira is like my right hand, but Shira was a student of mine at Manhattan School when I was there, and they've always expressed a desire to figure out how to be an administrator. And so I have a whole other job, and Shira does too, but Shira's trying to sharpen their skills to become a leader. And I realized after I got the job I have now and did the first competition that I've got to cede the power to Shira. 1, because I don't have the bandwidth, and 2, because that's the only way Shira's gonna learn how to do this, is taking bite-sized pieces of the leadership work, having me in their back pocket to say should we do this? Because I'm not sure. My instincts are different than Shira's because I have more experience. Mm-hmm. And then I can say, yeah, go do whatever you want. That sounds great to me, but go for it. And, being able to be centered in the values that we have because we've built this thing from nothing is really, to me, the most helpful thing because we don't have $100,000 this year. We may not even have 50. We have a couple grants outstanding, but we know we can put something together on a ham sandwich and a prayer because our values are aligned, And I think, and part of that comes from I really want to give that opportunity to someone else and see that power. But I also know I don't want Shira to fail because they don't have as much experience as I do. So we have to figure out that dynamic all the time together and be real about the resources and all that. But I think if we weren't centered in we really believe in what we're doing, so therefore a ham sandwich might be fine this year, I don't know that it works otherwise,
Well, thank you all. We're going to move to a Q&A time. I want to welcome the virtual audience who is tuning in. You can ask questions at either a mic. Those of you who are here in person, you can ask questions at either mic or via the Sphinx app in the Q&A section of the REN Live tab with access code REN. I had to write this down. For the record, they told me this and said, "Can you remember that?" And I was like, "Child, please, no, I'm not going to be able to. Somebody's write it down. I'm not going to remember that." But it is access code REN, and for those of you who are virtual, you can also engage with us as well. I'll recognize this person here. Please state your name and your organization if you feel comfortable. Your name and who you're representing today.
Sure.
So that we know who you are, and then I'll go from side to side.
My name is Rich Coburn. I'm here with the National Arts Centre Orchestra in Ottawa, Canada. And I have a question to the last point about creating aligned values. I have a team which is very motivated to do a lot of this work, but we have, of course, the challenges of, processes and systems which, give certain results. And I think that as an organization, we have a strategic plan which identifies a lot of these values of diversifying. But when we get down into the nitty-gritty of what exactly, why are these our values? What do they mean on a personal level? I think we run into a little bit of divergence, and that hinders our ability to go forward strongly and to seed power and to move in these directions. So I'm curious how you think about really drilling down into creating value alignment.
Actually, I'm glad you asked that question. That was actually something that we talked about earlier. Does anyone want to jump in on that one? I have a million thoughts, but they may be moderators, so I wouldn't talk so much. Go for it.
I was just going to end that one of the things you also have to probably have those conversations, sit in a room, have the conversations to determine where are those value alignments. That was part of the listening tour, and for me to take back information to the assistant general managers and the general managers to say this is where the organization, from our performers to our administrative staff, what they're thinking. And also in this role, since I'm a AGM and part of, quote, leadership of the Met, I also have to take the responsibility that there are times when I have to sit in that room, in that space to say, we're not doing that, or we need to make sure that we're doing that. And here are the things that we've heard that are the values. I mean, it's, the phrase of speaking truth to power, you have to be willing to be in that room and in that space to have that conversation. And sometimes people are like, well, why aren't you having it out in public? Part of the role, too, is to be an influencer. And sometimes you aren't going to influence when you're shaming people. And I know that sometimes there's a point when that does have to happen. But you also have to be measured. But you have to ask people, what are we thinking are our values, as opposed to I'm going to guess and try to read everybody's mind, because that superpower wasn't handed out to me. But so So you really do. You have to be honest and ask and be ready for the responses that people bring back, and then synthesize that so that you have a value structure.
And one of the things I would say as well, I know they gave me the moderator, but I'm going to answer that one because I like that. I love that. That's a question that I think a lot about, actually. One of the things is a codification of a term. So when the organization says that it values diversity, what does that mean? Does it mean one of each and then 98% white? Right? We have one at this level, one at this level, one at this level, one at that level. We are a diverse organization. Or does it mean we have a bunch of people of color who are at the bottom rung of our organization? So 50% of our staff is BIPOC, and 100% of them is 9 levels away from the CEO. Right? And so understanding, I think, on one level what that means, and having someone and like having real conversations about what that means is one. And then I think too, looking when you start doing your tactical work, looking at who's about this life via the tactical work. So if you have a program and you're getting all this pushback throughout the institution, it becomes really clear what the values are. Because again, they're your stated values and your lived values, your practiced values. And so when you start doing the work and you're really into it and you see that, wow, all we did was change some language in our job descriptions to make it more palatable to individuals who maybe didn't have advanced degrees, right? And now everyone's fighting that, right? So, I guess we are not about this life, right? And so then you can actually name it, though. You can say, why is there pushback against this seemingly simple way to achieve the value that we have stated that we believe in? And so I think that those two things, thinking about it from a codification of terms perspective, as well as tactically day in and day out, being able to say, if this would be a simple one that would be inside our values, so do we not actually value this? Because this would be an easy one. And so I think that might be a way of thinking about navigating an organization that, that has quite a bit of size and scope.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anne, and this question is from the virtual audience. Alexis mentioned that the American theater ideal is that it should be accessible for all, maybe even free for all. Could you share what you think it means to be a, quote, American orchestra?
Jury's out on that one for me. Sorry. I will say that, I started as a violinist, and I got a violin in a free public school program. My parents did not know anything about music. They spent all their extra money on college sports games, which did not much for me. So that's where I learned in a public school with a violin I did not pay for the first year or so of my life, and had to really search for ways that we could get a lesson for me for $10 here and there or whatever. And that to me is what it means to be American. That I found something I connected to, and my community helped me get there. And along the way, I gotta say, all of my teachers were incredible. They were all white. The only person I saw in a classical setting on a stage, I happened to be from Louisville, Kentucky, was Wayne Brown, because he was running the orchestra at the time. And now I have to say, highs and lows. My daughter, who's 5, is playing violin. Mr. Burnett's her teacher right there at the Harlem School of the Arts. So we see each other every Saturday, and God bless him, because this child, he knows. But anyway, that's her teacher now. In that I got to have that evolution where she goes and learns at Harlem School of the Arts every week, and that's her teacher, and that's how she knows music. I think is very American, and I'm really proud that my country can do that for me, and got me there. But I got lucky, right? I had parents who really believed in that, even though they didn't understand it, and figured out how to get tickets to things, but all that was there. And so I think for me, that is always in the way I have to work. I have to figure, I would never work for a place that didn't have something like that. So not only at the Public do we have free Shakespeare in the Park, but we also have a program, the last Shakespeare of every summer that we do has an entire cast of community members, people who might be formerly incarcerated and are in an arts program. We have 5 equity actors that play bigger roles, but it's a whole stage filled with people from the hood, and they're paid. We pay them. They're doing a service and we're paying them. So to me, there's ethos in all of that that I think we could really lean into more of, for sure.
I want to go back, since we have 3 audiences, so I want to make sure that this mic here is sitting in the front there. Yeah. Name and who you're representing, and then your question.
Good morning. I'm Vaughn Watson from Manhattan School of Music.
Hello,
Alexa.
Vaughn Watson.
Hi.
Sorry, we used to work together.
We did. And my question is kind of deep. We're seeing the ouster of Claudine Gay. We're seeing elimination of sociology programs in Florida. All of these are kind of symptomatic of what's been happening in the country, which we're seeing a very strong conservative backlash, and also victories in terms of getting rid of DEI. And I wonder how that's informing your work right now working at some of the most important institutions, arts institutions in the country. How is what's going on in the country impacting your work?
We're gonna let the lawyer answer that one.
I will say I was working at Harvard when Claudine Gay was the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. It was a powerful moment when she was there, and so it's been, I cried when all that was happening. I've asked the question quite directly to the leadership, to Peter Gelb and to others, that, is this going to shift us? I think that for the Met, the answer was no. The other reality, too, for us as institutions, unlike, what they're having in higher ed and some of these spaces where people are admissions process, and I think the same can be happening at other conservatories, where it's about how can I access that value? The reality is, I keep saying it, if we don't get an audience, and our audience dies out, the traditional white, upper middle class audience completely dies out and go away, and we have not done anything to bring other people in, then we don't exist anymore. So I think that is a very real driver, and why people are indeed holding on to DEI. Now the other questions are, because we do get asked, why are you doing this opera in this way? Why are you doing Fire Shut Up in Your Bones? Why do we have to do that? Well, as, quote, cultural institutions and setting norms, and we have to tell different stories. We have to bring in those different stories. That's how you, quote, really become a, quote, American opera company, or become a more international, diverse opera company, where you bring in Florencia in Amazonas, where you've never had a Mexican composer before, a Latinx composer. We have to, because if you want those audiences to come in, as well as the singers and the performers, and you want a next generation of orchestras, it can't just come from one particular community. So I don't think that's going away. I do think we're still gonna always, like we always have to fight for it, and not so much explain it and justify it, we just have to fight for it because it belongs to us. We are as part of America. It's, even as people want to talk about 1619, don't talk about that. Well, how'd y'all get here?
Yeah.
How did we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
We have to talk about it. It has to be part of that particular conversation. But I did highlight, and I do want people to know, with our internship program, we say we're looking for people who are underrepresented and have been marginalized. I got a letter and a note from somebody asking, well, I want to know what you mean by diversity and whether or not this is a program I should be applying for. Okay, bells went off, the lawyer bells went off, ding, ding, ding. Okay, in the case, the Harvard case, the justices in the majority opinion did say, well, looking at the uniqueness of individuals, it's also important, the way of putting aside this whole idea of what is diversity. it's the uniqueness. Well, we're using that language. It's like, so write us a letter about your uniqueness. We're not saying, no, white person, don't apply. Because that's what they, yes, and then the next thing we're filing a lawsuit against the Metropolitan Opera. No,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen. Because there is a uniqueness. There's socioeconomic, there's value, all of that adds to the diversity. But that should not mean we should not be going after the reality of people who have been underrepresented. And that is black and brown people, and that is also women in particular positions and roles. We have to bring them in. That work we have to do.
And it's beautiful.
I'm sorry.
Get it in. Go. Don't apologize. Oh, I'm always mic'd up. I would say, as a Manhattan School alum, also, I think this is a unique moment in history where a light is being shined on leadership more than it's ever been shined. I mean, as a leader, there are times when I go to my staff and I let them know, I'm like, listen, should I do this? And then there are times when I go to my staff and I'm like, I'm doing this, go find out how I can do it, right? I need you to just go and figure out, you find me the language that allows me to be able to make the program and make the thing that I want. And so and I tell them, this is a moment and I'm gonna need you to give me what I want and figure out how I'm gonna get what I want. And sometimes they're like, well, we talked to legal and they said, if you put this clause in, you might be all right. I'm like, okay, that's what so for example, that uniqueness thing there, I think that is a thing. And so I think this is a very unique time when you're looking at your organizations, those organizations that are pivoting right now, are pivoting away from their work, that decision came from the top. And so when you're looking at it, it did not come from a department, it came from the top. So the light should shine at the top of the institution when these things happen and the entire institution just pivots everything. There's essentially the top telling you, I'm actually not about this life. This is the point in which I'm no longer about this life. And so I think it's important for the leaders who are out there to know that people see what you're doing. Everyone does. And being very mindful of that your entire community, they saw what you just did.
Thank you for this conversation. Like Alexa, I wear two hats. My name is Eun Lee. I'm at Lincoln Center, and I'm also the executive director of the Dream Unfinished. And so I really value all the rich dialogue around how power moves within institutions, because I would love to hear how power moves between institutions. The legacy institutions, the large places, the grass tops, and then the grassroots, and what the conversation is there.
I think that's a great question, and I have one really specific example, which is I report to our artistic director, Oscar Eustace, and when I started there, he said, once you kind of figure out your system for working on each of the shows here, I think we really need to extend a hand to the other off-Broadway theaters around town, because Vineyard Theater is not going to be able to hire a senior director of AEB, but they might need us sometime. And so I actually did that for the first time recently. I went to MCC to work on their play, The White Chip, which is about sobriety, and we did a really rich culture session. And, they really responded to that. One, it just felt like industry service, and it really came about because one of our actors from the public was in that show and said this would be helpful to us. But I think coming from our artistic directors saying, it's not just us, we have to really make sure everyone has access to the things that we're doing here if it's working, if we know it's working. So just that specific example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We have time for, did you want to comment to that one as well, Shea?
If it's okay, I just wanted to talk about
please. We have time for one
the
more question.
affirmative action one, just from the vantage point of higher ed. I think it's important for everybody to acknowledge that part of the intent of that ruling is to intimidate us, to stop, is to roll back progress, right? And it's important to kind of acknowledge that. But I don't think it's going to work, because there's kind of a silver lining in that ruling. John Roberts went out of his way to basically say, well, nothing in this ruling should be construed to say that an applicant could not talk about their personal experience of race. And I think that has some interesting possibilities, right? What if it becomes normal for white applicants to start talking about what the impact of race has been in their life, in their essay? I think that would be really interesting. And I think it also could push organizations to sort of really define what are the actions, what are the practices, what are the attributes that they're looking for from the people who are populating these fellowships and these programs. And then we can kind of put our finger on what is it about our lived experience of being a person of color that like qualifies us to do something, or that moves us into a space where we gain certain skills and certain experiences. And I think there can be a little bit more emphasis on that, and basically being performative is just not going to cut it anymore. And so I think that can be, if we go about it in a strategic way, I think it could actually be a good thing.
We have time for one last question, and we will all, for those of you who may have questions we didn't get to, we'll be outside afterwards to continue answering questions of folks as they have them, but please.
Good morning. My name is Norma Lisa Thomas. I'm a cellist and orchestra director at the Denzel Washington School of the Arts in Mount Vernon, New York. I recently attended the Met to see the Malcolm X production. It was fabulous to see all those wonderful actors on stage, colored, black and brown people. Then I walked down to the pit to see the orchestra, because as an orchestra director, this is what I do. I raise up string players. You know, I'm a graduate of Manhattan School of Music as well, and I looked at that pit, I said, this is amazing. There's not one brown face, and the orchestra goes from one end of the stage to the other. Not one. I looked at the conductor, the directors, I said, this is just really, what is the problem here? So my question is, I'm a student of doctoral music of arts at Rutgers, and I'm moving up in my career. How do we get people into positions to help other string players? Like we have the Harlem Chamber Players over there with David, and they're right there in New York. Right next door is Juilliard. I have students who go to Juilliard as string players. How do we break this ceiling, and how do people who are qualified get into the positions to help bring up the next generation of black and brown string players right there in New York, which is a cultural center of this country? Just help me out.
I guess Weston was off that night.
Yeah, I was about to say, Weston, yeah. Stop subbing out. Don't sub out
Weston
tonight.
and Billy, but they're not string players, so, but yes.
I know we don't have much time left, so I'll say, I think the Black Orchestral Network would be a great place for your kids to start. We're very interested in, we think an American orchestra has to have people of color in it, has to have black musicians, and we understand that the things that will make orchestras more able to bring in black musicians and retain black musicians will allow everybody in that space to bring more of themselves to their work, and will be better for the field overall. So I think the Black Orchestral Network, blackorchestral.org, would be a great place to start.
Thank you.
And I will add that part of it is also, both in my role, I learn a lot. I mean, I am calling out Weston's prop, but the work that he does at Juilliard with the MAP program, this is for us and other orchestras to start making those connections with organizations to bring up the next generation. And there are a few ideas we've been trying to figure out. How do you create even fellowship opportunities? I'm not giving up on that, Weston, just so you know. But to bring in more musicians, black and brown musicians, into the orchestras. I will, as well as one of the things too for the Met is our associate musicians part, and there have been some changes where we are increasing that, meaning because we're an orchestra that also works sometimes 7 days a week because of the opera schedule, unlike other orchestras that may perform 4 times, we need to, nobody can perform 7 days a week, so we do need a whole group of associate musicians to help cover for each of the instruments. This is where, in the conversations both with the orchestra committee of the Met and with leaders like Billy and Weston, we have the conversation about how do we expand the opportunities for more musicians of color. But Kazim was the conductor. We had for X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, and we have more black conductors as well, and women conductors and women conductors of color coming in. That work, to be intentional about who we bring in, that's also part of the work, thinking about who does that. When we bring in a new piece and a new work, we have to keep doing that work.
Yeah, and for those of you who are not New York based, every city that I have been in and or visited has some program that is for young musicians of color, like every city that I have been around. And so if you don't know the one in your city, go find it. Don't start a new one. And I think that is, because I think to your point, we can't always see just how much collective power there is inside this work. And what someone will do is they'll ask 5 people. If those 5 people don't know of the thing, they create one. And then 5 years in, they found out that they just destroyed another one. There was, when I was growing up, there was this basketball league, and this is a closing story. There was this basketball league, and there used to be a guy who would, carry around the bag of basketballs, jerseys. The 1 o'clock game was wearing the same jerseys as the 2 o'clock game, was yellow and green. And he'd been doing that thing for a long time. Fast forward a few years, this organization got some money to create a basketball league. Everybody got jerseys with your names, you got shoes, and so everybody then left this thing to then go be part of that thing. And the funding ran out for that thing. His thing had died, and then this thing died, and by their involvement in my conversation, we no longer had a basketball league. Right? Because again, they didn't do the work of saying, instead of us building a new league, why don't we just support this league that's already there? And that way, if they bounced, we still got I can still wear the red and green jersey, the yellow and green jerseys, right? I go back to that. And so I think that when you're thinking about this, trying to find ways to these collective ways to galvanize all of this work in our communities will be so important. In closing, thank you so much. Thank you for these amazing questions. Round of applause to these wonderful colleagues here. Yeah, please. Yeah. I was going to make one last comment. Thank you, Kay. I hope I did okay.